The first of many memorial services for George Floyd was held in Minneapolis in the United States yesterday. Well, this as demonstrations against the killing at the hands of police spread from one state to another. Also in attendance at that memorial service was civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr., the son of assassinated American civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let's go live now to Atlanta, Georgia in the United States. Mr. King, a very good evening to you. Thank you very much for joining us here on SABC News.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Mr. King, get your foot off our necks is what Reverend Al Sharpton said during the memorial service for George Floyd, which you attended yesterday in Minneapolis. What would your father have said about history seemingly repeating itself in the treatment of black people in America?
You know, it's difficult for any of us to say what he would have said. I think what I would first like to say is, had he lived, we would not probably be dealing with these issues, because he wanted to eradicate from the world poverty, racism, and violence. And had he lived, I'm sure we would have been further along. But if he was to arrive and see what we are seeing right now, he would be greatly disappointed and distressed in the lack of leadership and the lack of community and the amount of racism that still exists within our society.
I took a look at a tweet that you'd also posted, Mr. King, just the other day. And, you know, that your father, you said, had explained during his lifetime that a riot is the language of the unheard. Do you think that these protests against the killing of George Floyd will be the turning point in America?
Well, I do think that it is strongly possible that this will be the turning point for how some police departments operate around profiling, racial profiling, around the treatment of Black people. And I say that because never has the world been mobilized. Well, really never has the United States been as mobilized. 50 years ago, over 50 years ago, 52 years to be exact, when my father was killed, we had rioting in over 100 cities in America. 52 years later, there are more cities, there are about 130 cities where protests are going on. Not all of them are violent, but constructive protests are taking place. And the difference is 52 years ago, it was mostly Black folk. There are some whites. Today, many of these demonstrations are being led by white people. Everyone is seeing that enough is enough. And there are also demonstrations all over the world. That is a dynamic that means that there's an energetic shift. And that energetic shift is going to help us to create a more just and more humane society. So yes, George Floyd's death, tragic death, may be the catalyst that causes us to make dramatic changes in this nation that hopefully will reverberate throughout the world.
Mr. King, I'm sure you'd agree with me that systematic change has to happen in America. But what would you say of criticism of the current American government led by President Donald Trump for what others say is putting fuel on that fire?
Well, I would say that that is absolutely true. The president his leadership has been abysmal, in my judgment. I'm not one who wants to be critical of a president or any president, but I am greatly disappointed in the leadership or the lack of leadership of the president. A president should bring people together, should be getting religious leaders to say, let's calm down, let's quell this situation, let's build community. But our president seems to be inflaming the situation with everything that he says. Fortunately, we are seeing the violence disseminated and that is a good thing. But the protests are still taking place, which is a good thing also. Yeah. The protests have to continue until some form of justice takes place. Now, we've seen 4 officers arrested. That's a good first step. But those officers have to be tried and convicted before a feeling of real justice has occurred. The reality is George Floyd should never have had to die. And there are others over a short period of time. Breonna Taylor, a few weeks ago in Louisville, Kentucky. Yeah. The police came down, knocked down her door, and she was killed. And then before that, Brother Aubrey here in Georgia, Brunswick, Georgia. Whites ran after him, and one of them was a former policeman, and they killed him. This has got to stop. And it is going to stop. I think Congress is going to present legislation. I think we're going to see a different America.
But why do you think it is still taking place? I think everybody refers and looks back to the struggle that your father fought before he was assassinated. And so many decades later, America is still having this conversation about it doing right by everyone who lives in that country. Systematic change, already we've spoken about, that needs to happen. But what do you think would correct what has been happening, according to all of you in America, for the longest time now? Apart from systematic change, apart from what you're saying is an abysmal showing by President Donald Trump in the manner in which he has handled this. You have the police officers who've been arrested and they're facing charges. But what is it that's going to take, that's going to rectify this once and for all?
Well, there's no one thing that is going to change. It is a combination of things and a combination of people, from senators to congresspersons, and even at the presidential level. So this morning I went to vote, my wife and I, and I've never seen so many people at the polling places. Right now, our nation needs to be mobilizing, organizing, protesting as we're doing, registering to vote, and voting in this election and all upcoming elections. And I think we're going to see that. I mean, I think the consciousness is aroused, is awakened. And you can't put things to sleep once they're awakened. People, we will not go back. I will say that at the last moment, if the Black community does not see some responsible change in a relatively responsible period of time, maybe we have to consider exercising our buying power somewhere else. We spent over $1 trillion in the American economy last year, over $1 trillion. If we decide we're going to stop economically supporting some of these corporations, I assure you that we will see changes right away.
And do you think, just finally, Mr. King, that voice of the American people could be demonstrated perhaps at the polls, given that it seems what you're indicating is that perhaps there are some Americans who believe that the wrong choice had been made?
Unfortunately, I did not hear your question. The connection was not clear.
Mr. King, I was saying that in light of what you just said, do you think that this is an opportunity for Americans who are unhappy with how the current leadership in that country is dealing with pressing issues, including race relations in the United States of America? It's their opportunity to exercise or make their voices heard in a vote which could possibly change, nobody knows, how currently the leadership of the United States, which you say has handled this matter abysmally.
Oh, it is absolutely. My father used to say, now is the time. And so the time has come before us that it is time for people to participate like never before and institute and implement these changes. The thing that's probably most interesting is, as I said, the whole world George Floyd's tragic death has galvanized energy pretty much on every continent of our world. And a lot of people around the world are saying this is unjust. Yes, and there are more in the United States than ever before that are saying this is unjust. The silent majority is aroused and awakened and participating, not just listening. Oftentimes people just listen, but the people are engaged and are doing something constructive, which is casting their votes. But we also have to help government. And I think we can use every modality, whether it's Twitter or whether it's even TikTok that our young people are using. Every last one of the technological modalities has to be engaged to bring about the change. And I see that happening as we are sitting here right now.
This certainly is a visual that we haven't seen, coming out of America in a very long time. How these, demonstrations had started and spread to other states. And also there were solidarity protests in other parts of the world. Do you think this speaks to a global challenge or a challenge of racism in many other parts of the world, outside even of the United States, on the backdrop of what we've seen in terms of these solidarity protests that we've seen in other parts of the world?
I certainly hope so. And my father and mother wanted to eradicate from the world poverty, racism, and violence. We have not, in the United States, we've not done enough to address racism. And now is the time. I talked to a congressman this morning about a piece of legislation that he's presenting so that the United States government and the president would have a cabinet level person to address racism in our nation and inequities in our nation. That, to be, if it is passed, says that the federal government is so concerned that there's a cabinet level position to address these issues, as well as poverty. And I think that has a good chance of passing. Certainly in the United States Congress, I think it's much more difficult in the Senate, but that's why we have to vote so that in November we can elect new people to office so that these all will be passed. And ultimately we will address racism and we will address poverty. And also we will address violence, the triple evils that my mother and father talked about throughout their lives.
I know that there are quite a number of other memorial services that are also scheduled to be held in George Floyd's honor. But from your perspective, in addition to Americans going out to vote and changing what is currently happening in America, do you think that perhaps there needs to be seen to be more political will? I know you've spoken already about the leadership of President Donald Trump. You said you're not often there to criticize any president, but do you think that could finally be something that could change the fortunes of Black Americans?
I think that the fortunes of Black America can and will be changed when we target our buying power. Most of the Black community, most of the money that exists is in white banks. And I haven't heard much from the banking community. Some I've heard, but not enough. When you look at all the clothing companies that are owned by white individuals, white companies, Blacks are the ones who make the margin of profit. So I think we have structurally and strategically think about whether we're going to continue to support these businesses. Those kind of things will cause those businesses to come to the table to say enough is enough. We are going to work with the communities to make things better for everyone in the community, specifically Blacks. And that change is ultimately be.
Mr. King, we're struggling with your line. I'm just going to try one more question here. The protests themselves or demonstrations did have a bit of a violent element. We saw the police chasing off some of the demonstrators, also including near the Lafayette Square, which is not too far from the White House. Is this what you believe is the only language that those in authorities seem to understand, in particular when you've had decades of oppression? And this is certainly something that your father did not stand for. He did not stand for violence.
Well, my father said that violence, as I think you said earlier, I've said this so much that I can't remember if it was with this interview, but my father said violence is the language of the unheard. When you listen, give people respect, dignity, treat them in a humane way, violence disappears. 52 years ago, people had signs when they marched in Memphis. I am a man. They were saying, Black people, to the system, we are human beings. Treat us with dignity and respect. And the system chose not to. 52 years later, Black people and white people and Latino and Hispanic people and others have signs that say Black Lives Matter. We should not have to say that to anyone. That should be a given in 2020, but it is not. But what everybody saw was a man killed in cold blood by a person supposed to protect and serve, and three other officers standing around watching. People are not going to tolerate it. The day has come for this to stop. I'm not saying that there won't be more incidents, but there's a more humane way to address all of these issues. And policemen and others have to be engaged to do it. And so I think that, yes, if you look at all the protests, there are more nonviolent protests. There's violence being shown. But police have taken these in some communities.
Yeah.
Sheriffs have marched with other demonstrators, the Lions in that community. We've seen all kinds of acts that are different. We've seen whites apologize to Blacks, all the bad behavior that is all these years. There's a lot of good that is out of this tragedy. And that will continue. These demonstrations will continue until justice is achieved.
Mr. King, I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave it here on SABC News. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank your team as well, who really facilitated this for us, especially on the backdrop of you being in the forefront once again of activism, civil rights activism in the United States of America. And I can certainly tell you that what is happening there has inspired many others around the world to take a stand against discrimination, not just in your country, but in other countries as well, where that is still being felt. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Good evening to you, sir. American civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr., who was also the son of assassinated American civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., joining us live from Atlanta, Georgia in the United States.